All right, tēnā koutou katoa, kia orana. Welcome to this afternoon session. I have the privilege of taking us through these next couple of minutes together and hopefully keep you guys all awake while we're going through it. We're talking about effective community engagement this afternoon and what matters to whānau. I'm just going to position where this space sits within the collective action framework that Amarjit just shared. I am a bit of a mover and a shaker, which might be annoying for our cameraman. I apologize in advance, but I'm not going to stand behind here. I'll be walking around a bit. So I'm just trying to make sure I'm seeing people and not hiding behind poles. So yes, Amarjit's introduced this collective action section and approach, and we're talking about what matters to whānau and community. So this component up in the top left corner, my left, your right. And interestingly, in the last session, she asked the question, you know, where do you need to start as an organisation? And a lot of the papers that I saw anyway were around this this component right here. So that's great. We all know it's important, and the question now is, how do we do effective community engagement? I do want to acknowledge that a lot of us have been engaging in communities for a long, long time, and anything I share is to add to what you perhaps already know, and hopefully to give you something new as well. So I'm going to start by defining what community engagement is, and I have done a webinar recently for the Collaborative, so if you've seen the webinar, I apologize in advance and invite your patience with me because I will repeat a few things, but any opportunity I get, I want to be nice and clear. So I'm going to break it down what I mean by community engagement, particularly within an equity context and within equity framework. So when I'm talking about community, I'm talking about the people most negatively affected by health outcomes, health and social outcomes. So we're not talking about our majority, we're not talking about those that are cool with our typical, traditional, standard ways of engaging communities. We are talking about those that are hard to reach. We're talking about those that are most vulnerable, and perhaps, as per, was it Helen's session this morning, those that are experiencing extreme suffering in our communities. When I'm talking about engagement, I'm also talking about connecting with the community, as I've defined, in ways that acknowledge, protect, and enhance their mana. So any opportunity we get to connect with other people with this community as defined, it's to ensure that when we leave them, they are better off for our engagement. They're not depleted, their mana isn't taken away from them, which happens in our system many, many times. When we engage, we can extract what we need, develop our awesome plans, and roll out these strategies, rather than having this relationship with them that ensures that we've both mutually benefited from our engagement and our connections and our ongoing relationship. So if we put that together, we've got a lovely definition here. You can quote it under my name. I totally made this up, but yeah, community engagement is connecting with our most negatively affected communities and in ways that enhance their mana. Now, for all of us, that is going to mean Māori. For all of us, that is going to mean Pacifica. For all of us, that is going to mean disabilities. For many of us, that's going to mean some of our rural communities, and then so forth, te mea, depending where you are in our beautiful country. Oh, see? Green button. So why does it matter to me? And I want to take a moment just to talk about why I care so much about this work that I get to do. So I was born and raised in South Auckland. I'm a Māori Cook Island girl. I'm from Ngāpuhi, the far north. And while I was born and raised in South Auckland, I currently reside in Whangarei, so servicing or working in Te Tai Tokerau. I was born into a strong faith-based family, to parents who loved the Lord, they loved us kids, and they loved people. And growing up, they instilled in us the values of serving those who are most vulnerable in our community. When I turned 18, I thought I was a big girl. My parents decided to move to Australia, and I decided to stay in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because I thought, one, I'm going to go on and do some higher education. I'd just gotten a scholarship to do my undergraduate business degree, but also because I thought I was in love. Fast forward 4 years, I had my degree, a diploma, no boyfriend, and I've become a little bit unwell. So growing up, I was never a small girl. I was healthy, you know, you're Pacifica, you're Māori, you eat well, and I put on a bit more weight than I'm used to after I finished university. So I decided to do, at the time, a detox. And this turned into this obsession with health and well-being. Fast forward another 18 months, I'd lost 30 kgs, I was excessively exercising, and I withdrew myself from more social situations where food was involved. Now, for a Māori Pacific girl, that's pretty much everything. So very isolated. And I ended up in Middlemore Hospital in Auckland with what doctors thought was a minor heart attack and diagnosed borderline anorexia. And then I was referred to mental health services for the next 18 months, where I would undergo what I now know to be CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a whole lot of other prodding and primping and meetings and hui and stuff like that. At the time, I was working in education, and I moved into health because my experience showed me and told me that our system needs to do better for girls like me. The first day I walked into the service, my eating disorders nurse looked at me and said, it's unusual for girls like you to come through our service. And in my mind, I interpreted that to mean, we don't know what to do for you. You're unusual, you're an anomaly, and I felt that way consistently through that service. I also began to retrain. So I'm working in health now, and I went back to not back to studies. I studied while I was at Counties Manukau District Health Board at the time, and I learned about this new framework called, well, not new, but new to me, community organising, which is basically a power shifting framework that works with communities that have their values threatened in any sort of way and empowers them to create changes that matter to them. Suddenly, I had a framework and I had a language of how I could turn things around, not just in my own health and well-being, but for others. And by this point, my parents had also come back from Australia, 6 years. My mum had 2 degrees, she was a minister, she had 2 churches, my siblings were in school. They packed up everything to help me get well. And that really is what accelerated my healing. And for me was the experience I had of where effective communities are the holders of well-being, not the system, not even though we play a part, but effectively it's our communities that can help us. It's our whānau that can help us get better. And had I not had them, who knows where I would have been today. So at Counties, I then went on to lead a campaign which we named Handle the Jandle. And how I started this campaign was I went out and I told a version of my story to a couple of other young people, and I heard their stories as well. And we recruited them into this campaign to be leaders of this campaign. So we went out, I had 15 people on my list, 15 young people that I identified, and then we confirmed these 5 to start with, who called ourselves the Fob 5, fresh off the boat with ideas, with energy, with things that we wanted to do. And yeah, and we formed and launched this campaign, Handle the Jandle. And the way we launched that was we went out. We just went out and asked our community through our first 15 sports teams, through our university classes, wherever we were naturally connected in our community. And we asked this question: what matters to you? What matters to you in your community as a young Polynesian, as a young Māori, because we did define Polynesian as both Māori and Pacific. Predominantly, we were working with Pacific, but yeah, both. And we asked this question: what matters to you, and what makes you really angry when you look at your community? And overwhelmingly, this is what we heard. I would summarize in a statement was, it's like living in 2 worlds. One world is steeped in our faith, our family, and our culture. And then the other world is about science, it's about individualism, institutionalism, when we go to school, when we go to university, and it's hard to be in that space. So when I first started out on this work, the board at Counties said to me, we want you guys to address and fix suicide. And you have 6 months. Said, wow, okay. And when we came back, that this is what young people cared about, they did care about suicide, but they didn't want to talk about suicide. They wanted to talk about, how do we just deal with being in this space? So we had to go back and advocate to our board. Yes, we're going to address suicide, but we're going to do it in a different way. Why? Because we're going to listen to what matters to them and follow and support what matters to them. So my 5 leaders went out through their natural networks and connected with another 5 leaders who became part of our extended network of community leaders, young community leaders within the network. And we trained them in 2 days of community organizing. Now, community organizing is a full-on, like, you go and learn the stuff, and we had 2 days to train with them. We also brought in US experts to help us, because at the time we didn't know much. Even though I trained, I was still learning. And together, over those 2 days, we developed a campaign timeline, a strategy to host and lead the largest Pacific youth workshop, mental health workshop in South Auckland, which we achieved. We also formed what we call a Snowflake team structure. So the whole point of this approach is to multiply yourselves. It's to make yourself redundant, as Karorio said earlier. And so I was coaching and supporting my 5, they were coaching and supporting their 5. So they had both responsibility to me, or accountability, but also responsibility out to coach and develop the leadership of the young people that they were working with. We did, like I said, achieve our first goal, and in fact we went on to engage over 1,000 community youth and work with a whole lot of partners, providers, to collaborate with them to develop all sorts of workshops for young people. And then we went on to train and further develop the leadership skills of these young people, to the point where we didn't need our US experts anymore. I stopped having to pay that bill. And my team now, who grew to a number of 12, which I sustained over about 6 years, they then began training other young people within their community, to the point where we launched 3 sub-campaigns to address different aspects of well-being that mattered to those communities. One of the things we used to consistently talk about in our campaign was, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Has anyone heard this proverb before? Right, an African proverb. And we can continue to remind ourselves that we can create quick fixes when we're talking about engagement with communities. Handle the Jandal went on for 6 years, and it was meant to be a 6-month project. But what we realized, what we learned, is that relationships, as someone else said before me, take time, and they take money, they cost. And not just this currency, it does require some of that, but a lot of it is relational currency and commitment to the ongoing work that matters to that community. So I assume everyone here agrees that community engagement is important and that we need it. So my question to us, to not start because I'm already down the track, but the question I want to ask is, in your context, why do you think we either don't do it or we don't do it well? Anyone want to answer that question? Just raise your hand. Why don't we do it? Or why, if we do it, why don't we do it well? Amajit, you're not allowed, no.
I'm not allowed.
You are allowed. Go ahead.
I think there's 2 things. One is resource, as in the dollars to do it and do it well. Yep. And it comes back to that real front-end investment. But the other is not having the confidence to do so, because those community conversations are very, can be challenging. Absolutely. And it's knowing how to deal with those in a way that builds trust. So yeah, great. Those are the 2 things.
Have others experienced or had those experiences where it's quite hard to, where do we start? Any other feedback? Why don't we do it or do it well? Time.
I'm thinking about a couple of specific projects that I got involved in over the last couple of years. And they were almost like a bit of money thrown at the community to do something. Community didn't have the right structure in place to receive the money, so we helped them to build a structure so that something could happen. But the time frame was really short. Yep. And there was expected to be marvelous outcomes in a very, very short time, and the community takes time.
Yeah, unrealistic timeframes. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to ask for one more because I think there's some bubbling answers here. Thank you. In the middle there.
Not having the confidence to push outside the constraints that are put on you. Yeah. So it might be a contract, or it might be the time. Your example was 6 months and it took 6 years. Yeah. But if you didn't push for that and just went, oh, well, we tried and didn't quite get there. Yeah. But you need some confidence and some backing to push outside whatever those constraints might be.
Absolutely. So I think where some people in those responses even are touching on some of the conditions that are going to require to support us to engage more effectively. Is there one more? I felt like I saw someone wriggling. If you think I'm looking at you, I am. No? No? Okay. Oh, right here in the middle. Yes. Kia ora.
Kia ora. I think sometimes it's hard to know who to engage with. that you have a whole range of different views, and you have the people who speak up, but there's a very big group who don't say much at all, but have the same experiences. It's often hard to know who you engage with, how do you form a group, and how do you get a representative view from the community or input.
Absolutely, thank you. So yeah, there are a lot of challenges to engaging effectively, and I'm sure more than what we've heard this afternoon. And I do want to touch on one particularly, because I think it's one we don't consider a lot, and perhaps it is a construct as mentioned earlier today, but I do want us to consider this a bit more deeply in this session, because I think it's actually really important in terms of the way in which we view power, in the way in which we exercise power. Because when it comes to community engagement, fundamentally what we are asking ourselves to do and challenging ourselves to do is give power away. So, within collaboration, we want to be doing this, we want to be hand in hand, we want to be all around the mulberry bush, we want to be working together and da-da-da. Really hard to make that happen, and I know we've all had different experiences like that. But often what it turns into is this power struggle, right? Where we're struggling against competing interests, competing timelines. Communities operate on a totally different timeline to our financial timelines and our, annual timelines and our whatever political timelines. And so it turns into this power struggle, it may seem. And often what's happening is we're starting to feel the tension of the imbalance of power between us who sit in influential places within the system and the communities that we serve, the populations that we serve, particularly those that are most impacted by negative health outcomes. So when I look at this room, and I've heard a bit about what different people do, and I know a few people in here as well, but when I look at this room, what I see is very powerful people. Because of where we sit in the system, whether you're a clinician on the front line, whether you're in the DHB, whether you're, not DHBs anymore, the new, whatever they're called, regions, whether you're on Te Whatu Ora, wherever we sit as influencers, we have incredible power to influence change. And so this construct, this concept of power is one that I want us to dive into a little bit deeply. But for, again, definition's sake, I want to define it as per Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I think this is the second Martin Luther King Jr. quote from today. And he says that power simply is the ability to achieve purpose. If you have a purpose, if you have a goal and you are able to achieve that, you have a level of power. May not be the same as my power or someone else's power, but if you can achieve what you care about, what you want to do, that is power. Now, talking about power, there's this concept of, and it's starting to emerge more and more over the last decade, and it's been introduced by Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Timms, about new power and old power. And within this construct of new power and old power is really our traditional way of exercising power. So it can be referred to as a type of currency. The more currency or the more position you hold within old power, the more you can exercise your interests, you can assert your interests. It's often held by a few, it's often leader driven or top-down driven, and it's often closed and very private. So it's exclusive. If you're in, you're in. If you're not in, you're not in. And fundamentally, old power is transactional. So it's a one-way, and I would say it's a consumer-focused space where you consume, I deliver, because I've got all the answers as an organization, as a whatever, and you're just a consumer, and I'm just going to deliver that to you, and that's that. So it's a one-way transactional relationship. The emerging space we're seeing is new power. Now this, unlike a currency, is more like a current, meaning it flows through informal networks, it flows through different relationships. It actually bypasses the hierarchies that we have organizationally, and it sits with many people. So it sits through networks, it sits through a lot of informal networks. It's pulled in, so rather than exclusive and pushed down from the leader and I put out the strategy and everyone does it, it's actually pulled in from the input of many, it's shared, it's open, and fundamentally and importantly, it is relationship based, meaning that it is mutually beneficial that we are in this power relationship and we are sharing that relationship together. So some of the examples of how we're seeing these dynamics occur in our wider beyond health kind of space is Uber, for example, that challenged, this is a network of drivers that effectively were supported by platforms, our our digital space that supports large people to participate in networks, organized networks, and then that challenges our traditional, for example, taxi systems. Uber is an example. We've got a whole lot of examples where new power is starting to threaten in some way or challenge the old power systems. And I'm not saying either or all is completely taking over the world. What I am saying is these dynamics are occurring, and in health, they are also occurring. The thing that's happening in terms of not just what old power and new power looks like is how people view power, particularly consumers, and I use that word tentatively, because consumers now have a greater expectation of being participants in the services they receive. They no longer just want to consume what we give them. And in health, sometimes it's just easier. We go faster if you just do what I tell you to do. But now consumers have an expectation because of a whole lot of shifts, paradigm shifts within the community, within business, within the world. We just have to look at the world and know that power dynamics are starting to come to the fore, right? We've got the Black Lives Matter movement. We've got all sorts of things because consumers now have more of an expectation to be effectively engaged in the services that we deliver. And as health, we need to be mindful that now we're not just dealing with complicit or compliant perhaps populations, but populations that want to be involved. And there are a whole lot of values that sit behind old power and new power, and they're here. One of them that I want to focus on a little is radical transparency. With an old power, it's very exclusive, like I said. With a new power, everyone knows, and then we have platforms like social networks and so forth that make it possible for people to transparently share data and information. So IAP2 is an engagement spectrum, and this to me is another version of of lifting up or highlighting this power dynamic that's taking place. So for those that know IAP2, the further up the spectrum you move from informing, consulting, all the way through to empower, the more power, I guess, the more new power you're moving toward, the more new power models you're operating in collaboration and empower. So when you come down this way, obviously it's lower levels of engagement, lower levels of power sharing, and when you move up to collaboration and empower, you're increasing the ability of those populations you serve to be involved in design and in partnership. One of the health networks in Canada, the Greater Hamilton Health Network, have actually adapted this into what's called the ladder of engagement. And to summarize quickly before I point you to your table, because this is on your table, the red kind of zones are very organizational led power type initiatives. So the organization designs, the organization leads, the organization has very little or no feedback available for the people that they serve. If you move into the yellow zone, there is a bit more sharing of information and hearing from your providers. It might, from your populations. This might look like things like surveys, like kind of engaging patient feedback through surveys and so forth. But when you move into collaboration empowerment, you're now working in partnership, and in the empowering space particularly, there's equal partnership with your population. So what they say is important is what you do. And within Handle the General, that's why it's one of the highlights of my career, because we actually did exactly what they did, not without some fights with my DHB and my board, but we did it, and we're really lucky to do it at the time. So I'm going to direct you now to this engagement, ladder of engagement, that's on your table. And I just want you to find a post-it note thingy, a little dot there, you've got a circle. And I want you to think about your own organization, whether it's a general practice, whether you're in Te Whatu Ora, whether you're in a PHO, wherever you may sit, and really, generally think about where on that ladder would you vote your own organization in terms of its engagement approach. Are they in the red zone somewhere? Are they in the yellow zone? Or are they right up there in the green zone? So I'll give you a minute or two to do that. All right, I'm going to get us just to come back into the main space. All right, so I want to get a sense of within the room, across the room, and I want everyone to get this sense of where you kind of voted your own organisation, your own organisation's view or approach to community engagement. So what I'm going to do that is get everyone to stand up. E two. Oh, that was a bit slow and creaky. We're getting to the afternoon. I think we need some sugar soon. Don't worry, guys, 15 minutes, we will be there. All right, so what I'm going to do is we're going to do this by tables. I was going to do it individually, but then I don't want anyone to feel a little bit left on their own. So I want you to look at your engagement ladder and kind of look at where most of your dots are, whether they're in the green zone, the orange zone, or the red zone. You don't have to tell us within there where. And then I'm going to ask some questions, and you're going to, as a table, respond to these questions based on where the majority of your dots are. Okay, so if the majority of your dots are in the red zone, take a seat. We won't judge. Be honest. So the table at the back? That was kind of a split table there. Okay, they're a bit split there. That's okay, you can do that as well. Okay, if the majority of your dots on your table are in the orange or yellow zone, take a seat. Oh, and then I was going to say, and if you're still standing, everyone else give them a hand. There we go. All right, so from that little exercise, what I can see is generally we're sitting in this informed consult involved space, correct? We did have a few split. Were there any tables? I know the one at the back was kind of split across. I did actually see that. I came and had a little nosy. Were there any other tables that were similar where you kind of had dots all over? Yep. Okay, so we had about 4. I want to ask maybe to this table at the back. You sat down in the red zone? Was that correct? 2 red and 2 orange. Can you give us a little bit of insight why red? Like what do those engagement approaches or strategies look like in practice from your perspective?
I think mainly the fundamental difference is that we're representing 2 different so one with a
Okay, so previous and current orange. Awesome. To this table at the back, were there any practical ways that you're seeing that engagement reflected? I think you guys had some split spaces. Awesome. All right, so generally we're in the yellow space, but I think fundamentally what we're saying here and seeing here is that we can all do better and we can all continue to engage better. I'm going to be really upfront and say that obviously I'm advocating for the green space and I operate in the green space, and hopefully the tools really quickly in the last couple of minutes of the session that I'm going to provide, or even just an insight to them, because to be honest we don't have time for full-on tools, but just an insight into those will help you think about how might we do that better, how might we move ourselves through to higher levels of engagement and power sharing with the communities that we serve, particularly our communities most negatively impacted or affected. So to community organising, which is one of the approaches that I advocate, but also is one of the ways we can do this better. There are a range of approaches to community engagement. This one for me fundamentally sits up in the top of the green, is that it? Oh, in the top of the green. So it is an approach that came out of social movements, so social mobilization. How do you get mass participation towards shared outcomes based on core values that we share? And it's a whole framework around what are the key elements within those movements that we've seen over time, and distilled down into some really practical tools and ways of applying those practices so that we can better engage with communities and empower them onto their journeys, and within our context into the journey of well-being, haura, and health. So it does 3 things. 1, real change. We don't want to sit around and kind of talk about change and create strategies for change and not actually do any change. So the practices of organising ensure that change is apparent and visible and palpable. Second, it creates long-term capacity, really key. It's not just about creating change, but that the communities you're working with and alongside and partnering with are actually enhanced in their own agency and ability to act on the values and the things that matter to them. So you're building that capacity, which means we can all be made redundant. We can step away from that community and they continue to thrive and address whatever other issues or things that threaten that community and their values. And fundamentally, talking about power, which we've been doing this afternoon, it changes power. And it changes power by redirecting resources and rebalancing or shifting the balance of that power. So I think this is really a critical piece of organising that helps us address that power issue that we often don't talk about in health or consider in health, particularly around our theories of change and the strategies and programs we deliver. We don't ask ourselves, how are we addressing the power imbalance here? So organising offers a way for us to effectively do that and deliberately and intentionally do that. And I want to say, none of this stuff, community engagement, just happens. It needs to be orchestrated, engineered, enabled, supported through the systems that we set up, through the people that we engage, etc. It doesn't just happen. And I think what we have now with the reforms is the opportunity to do just that. Be more deliberate about empowering the communities that we serve. So within organising, power is not defined as a position. It's not defined as, a trait or quality that someone holds. What it's defined as is this mix or this influence created by the relationship between one's interests and one's resources. So within this room, we all have interests and we all have resources that we can use to achieve the interests that we have, or to assert our values, to achieve our interests. Now, one person who has more resources and a certain interest may have more power than a person who has less resources. So what organising does is it builds the network to combine resources, combine whatever those look like, tangible, intangible. And one of the key resources is time, where people commit their time to something that they care about. And then they find new or common interests and they assert or they plan towards strategies or outcomes that help achieve those interests as a community or as a group. So it's this dynamic of interests and resources that we're really talking about with in terms of power and how we shift power. There are 5 leadership practices that help us enact the overall approach of community organising. Fundamentally, we start with shared story. And the reason why story and narrative is important and is the reason why I started with my own personal story today is to, 1, be able to articulate clearly to people, 1, why I care, 2, why we care based on potentially the potential of the values that we share in this space or towards this threat or this, whatever it is, diabetes, whatever it could be. And thirdly, what is our call to action? What are we going to do about it and how do we do that collectively? So shared story, public narrative is a session in and of itself. I deliver some of these sessions, but it's a really powerful way of being to articulate your values through story. So not just standing up and say, I care about X, Y, Z, but this is what I went through, this is what I experienced, and you can feel the values that come from that. Shared commitment is also the next step. This is about relationships and where commitment becomes the currency of the relationship. So it's not necessarily money. A lot of this work has been developed or studied out of commitments, just people volunteering because they care about a whole lot of movements. The Obama campaign, and again, I'm not trying to get political, but the Obama campaign was really achieved through this approach, through this whole approach of organising. Obama himself is an organiser. He comes from an organising background, and so used that to really get him into presidency at the time. So shared commitment, shared structure. How do we structure ourselves as a network so that we can achieve our outcomes and harness the power and the resources that we bring together? Again, tangible, intangible, shared strategy, and then shared action. And these are all based on our shared values, being able to know what is it that we all care about in this space collectively, and then how are we going to work to those. And again, we're working through developing the leadership practices. So leadership in this context is not about a position, it's about a practice. If you can practice these skills and practice these practices, that is leadership versus because you hold a role, because you sit in a certain seat or in a certain organization, which means everyone can be a leader within this space. When we're thinking of building collective action through these practices, there's two types of organizations, or there's two types of strategies, there's two types of approaches in the world when it comes to creating change. One is very disorganized, right? It's passive, there's a lot of silos, there's a lot of drift because we don't have a clear way forward, or actually one we all agree on. We're very reactive, and in health, because of a whole lot of circumstances, not just because we choose, but because of the stretch of our resources, of our workforces, etc. COVID's compounded that. We are reacting. We're not, ahead of the game. We're just trying to keep above the influx of need that we're seeing in our communities. And sometimes there's inaction. We just don't act because we don't even know where to start. It's overwhelming, and we become paralyzed. And when you think of an organization or a space or a leadership perhaps that is organized, they have motivation. So it's not just cognitive, because I get your strategy, I'm on board. It's because actually I'm connected to that at a values level. I hear that, I understand that, and I believe in that. We're united, we're working together, we're collaborating together, we have clear purpose, initiative, and change. And the way in organizing that we move from this space to the organized space is through our practices. Shared story helps us become more motivated in our collaborative efforts. Relational commitment helps us become more united and addresses the silos that we experience at all different levels. Clear structure gets us directed and purposeful. Creative strategy focuses on initiatives that we take versus reacting to what's happening in our environment. And finally, effective action produces change rather than inaction. So to put it another way, the 5 practices can be summarized in this way. Shared story, commitment, and clear structure, the first 3, is about building power, building the resource base, building time, building the relationships. And I would argue this is the part that's going to take 6 years. No, not 6 years, but this is the part that we need to build in better into our planning, not just of our localities, but of the work that we do in our communities. What often happens is we move into this space really quickly. Strategy. We need to deliver things, so we create a strategy, we roll out a strategy, and then we've got no metaphorical oil in the tank because no one's committed, there's not a clear structure, no one knows where we're going and how we're doing it, and we're trying to use that old power approach or model to push something, and then we wonder why it's so hard, why it feels like we're pushing, uphill. So creative strategy and effective action is about taking that power and harnessing that power, the collective power of the people and the communities that we serve. So again, like I've said, because this is a relational approach, I would say we need to build in time at the beginning to really do this stuff well. And I say it's stuff lightly, but actually it's important. Relationships are important. And I think today I've heard that over and over again in different ways. So then it comes to unleashing that power. And I love this word because you know what? Communities operate this way without our help, just saying. We saw this morning an example from Pihiauri Marae where mana whenua are already operating in their own space inherently. They're already doing things, whether there's funding or not, whether there's this government or that government, whether we're around or not around, communities are already living, breathing, operating, and they will be there long after we're gone. And I say that this for us in the system, but we are also part of our own communities. I'm also a young person in my community, well, youngish. And, we all have different communities, faith communities, marae communities, sports communities. We are all part of our communities. So when we're talking about taking that power and unleashing it through this process, really it's about, and this is a bit of a busy picture, I don't quite like it myself, it's not very flash, but anyway, you have leaders that step up, or you identify leaders in your network, you build community around that leadership, like community, bringing those resources together, and again the resources are both tangible and intangible. It's people, it's skills, it's networks, it's talents, it's assets, and then collectively they start to move, that movement of power shift, the power shift movement towards change that matters importantly to them. Sometimes it means there's going to be an opposition to overcome. a status quo to overcome, or perhaps a threat to overcome, whatever that looks like within our populations. But yeah, sometimes it does require us to face that and push through that to achieve the outcome. So were I to summarize that piece, I would say when you're unleashing community-led power, strategy is turning the resources you have, and we all have them. If you're working in any community, which we all are, there are resources there that are already available to us. So it's about turning those resources into the power you need to achieve the change that you want. For a locality, because I know this is one of the core parts of our reforms, these are some of the first steps we might take in the locality spaces. One, identifying and developing our community leaders. And I want to be clear that this is not always going to be our established community leaders, you know. So one thing I often hear in the Pacific space, not from Pacific people, but kind of non-Pacific people, is, oh, if we want to engage Pacific people, we'll go to ministers and churches. Yes, because ministers have huge influence in the faith of Pacific communities. But there are a lot of less established community roles and influences that are sitting there that actually have a whole lot of power and network in terms of their influence in the community. And similarly, within our reforms, we've got the Iwi Māori Partnership Boards, really important key structural piece in the whole of the reforms. But beyond that, there's also going to be leaders that work, for example, on looking after their local marae, that take care of their whenua that's located around their marae, people that are influential. And I know that we talked about one of the challenges, just knowing where to start. But sometimes it's just asking the question, like, who are the movers? Who are the shakers? And in other parts of the world we've seen, and maybe locally, can't remember, but we've seen where hairdressers have a clear influential role because they've got someone, if you're a lady, you know this, sitting in their seat for 3 hours that shares their story and may just drop something like, oh yeah, no, I've got this really sore, whatever, chest, you know, I've got a whole lot of stress. And I know in some projects that found the power of those influencers or those hairdressers to arm them with resources to refer these ladies that were sitting in their seats for hours into health services or their local social providers. So again, it's looking at potentially not just the established community leaders, but those that are influential and well networked throughout the informal network in the community. Build community around those leaders, and again, build power out of that community. So I've flown through this and I'm wrapping up now, but we do have some upcoming workshops that I'm going to support with the collaborative. So it's going to be a bit of a more deep dive into the leadership practices of organising. We are going to Auckland, and I've just clocked, I think Amajit just made a comment and reminded me that we are having the Auckland workshop at Home Ground. Is that right? Yeah, so we've got the Auckland workshop at Home Ground, so that's on the 19th of October, and then we've got a workshop in Christchurch later in the year, on the 23rd of November. So I'll be delivering a bit more into the practices and how groups or communities and within our health sector might be able to apply some of these practices into the work that we all do. I want to finish with a challenge, and the challenge comes out of a document, actually an article that was written by Jeremy Hymans and his colleague. And this is how he summarized his whole incredible academic article. And this is one of the most powerful quotes that I pulled and want to present to us all as a challenge to close this session. The greatest test for the conductors of new power will be their willingness to engage with the challenges of the least powerful. So my wero to all of us is to think about how you can apply more effective approaches to sharing the power with the communities that you serve, particularly those that are the least powerful in our environment of increasing equitable outcomes. On that note, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa.